We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. We're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down to the Capitol. So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. And Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution.
In December 2020, as Donald Trump was holed up in the White House, refusing to admit he'd lost the recent election to Joe Biden, an old friend dropped in to urge him to concede. "Why don't you invite Biden to the White House, take him by the hand, and show him around?" the friend asked. "It would be the elegant solution," they told Trump. Trump's response was short and final. "You're elegant, and I'm president of the United States, so get out of my office." You're elegant, and I'm president of the United States, so get out of my office. And that kind of sums up who Donald Trump is and how he became president of the United States. Folks have asked me, what's my plan for Trump with his non-consecutive terms? I'll tell you. It'll be the same as when I covered Grover Cleveland, the only other president to serve non-consecutive terms. Today's episode will cover Donald Trump's early life to the end of his first term. We'll then get episodes on Biden, and after that, somewhere down the road, we'll get a final episode on Trump that will start right after he left office in 2021. There will definitely be moments from Trump's first term that you remember that don't get covered here. The whole conceit is to do this in an hour or less, which means a lot won't make it. I would love to hear from you in the comments, though. What do you think should have been in this episode, and what do you think would make a great deeper dive episode down the line? But for now, let's start as we often do. In the beginning, New York City, 1946. Donald John Trump was born on June 14th, 1946. To Mary Ann, a stay-at-home mother, and Fred Trump, a real estate developer father. And let me tell you, Donald took after the father. Fred Trump liked to build middle-class housing on government contracts. He liked to build middle-class housing on government contracts because if he told the government it would cost one thing and actual construction costs less than that, he could pocket the difference. Okay, actually, this is illegal, but he did it. Fred Trump also liked to rent to white families. If a black or Latino family tried to rent from him, they were probably going to be told nothing's available. This was also illegal, but he also did it. To make sure he got the best rates from contractors, Fred often assumed an alias when he called them. "Hey, I'm Harry Green. How much would it cost for yada yada yada?" His son would emulate the tactic, but for different purposes. New York media would one day know the voice of John Barron, a publicist nobody had ever met in person, but who sounded a whole lot like Donald Trump, and who loved to tell journalists what an amazing, handsome, smart guy Donald Trump was. Donald, he grew up in a nice home, but not a mansion. The glitz and glamour, that would come later, built largely by Donald. When young Donald was 13, his father sent him to a military academy that had a record of abuse. From there, he went to college at Fordham, then business school at Wharton, and then into the family business. I'm honestly not sure if he ever interviewed for a job in his life. In 1973, when Donald was 27 years old, the family business was sued by the Justice Department for housing discrimination against black tenants because they were totally discriminating against black tenants. The Trumps needed a lawyer. They found Roy Cohn. Do you remember Senator Joseph McCarthy from episodes 34 through 37, Eisenhower through Nixon? McCarthy was the senator who claimed to have a secret list of communists in the government. He didn't. That was all made up, but it didn't stop him from pointing the finger at anyone who drew his ire, accusing them of being a communist and ruining their life. His name is now synonymous with government witch hunts. Roy Cohn had been one of his investigators. Cohn focused on purging homosexuals out of the government, despite being a closet homosexual himself. Cohn's core belief was that the dog who barks louder wins. He loved to intimidate his enemies into submission, or at least into getting out of his way. Donald Trump hired Cohn to help with the housing discrimination case against his family. And guess what Cohn's advice was? Don't settle, sue the feds. Now, Trump did eventually settle and pay a penalty because, yeah, his family business totally was discriminating against black tenants, but this feisty, if someone comes for you, punch back mentality would become Trump's hallmark. If city officials didn't grant Trump permits he needed, which wasn't often because his family always greased the wheels with political donations, which normal for construction in New York, he would threaten or bully the official standing in his way, telling them he was rich and powerful and he wouldn't forget what they'd done. And if that didn't work, he would try to hire them. You can't stop me if I'm paying you. When invoices to contractors came due, Trump often found some flaw, some reason to pay only part of the bill. And he would argue that the contractor should practically be paying Trump because just saying they had worked on a Trump property would help them get other business. Over several decades, Donald Trump gradually inherited the family business, rebranding it Trump Corporation and placing his own personal brand at the center of corporate strategy. Trump wanted to be seen as wealthy. He wanted to be seen as successful. He wanted to become synonymous with glamour. He became a regular presence at New York's ritziest clubs and strove to have a new bombshell on his shoulder every week. He expanded the family business into casinos. He expanded it into airlines. He bought football teams and skyscrapers. He expanded into anything that would build his personal brand for extravagance. And he borrowed a lot of money to do it. And then he almost went bust. That football team he bought, its league folded. The airline, total failure. The casinos, they were struggling too. In 1990, Trump reportedly owed $3.2 billion to banks and $69.5 million to subcontractors for his casinos. But there's a funny thing about debt. When you have a little debt, like say a credit card payment, if you're late on that, they will hit you with ever-growing fees until the cows come home. But if you owe a lot of debt, millions or billions of dollars of it, well, then the banks actually start to worry that you might not pay them back. And while it's nothing off their back if you don't pay them the $300 in credit card debt you might have, it's a major issue if you don't pay back the $3.2 billion you owe them. So, banks often get flexible in helping debtors restructure their debt so they can repay it later, sometimes even loaning more money in the hopes that if they give you just a few million more, you'll be able to turn things around and save their whole investment. The banks gave Trump this latter treatment. Some restrictions were placed on him. He had to turn a mansion he had bought at Mar-a-Lago into a club and sell memberships so he could afford to keep it, for example. He declared 4 bankruptcies to get other debt off his books, and then he got to write that debt off his taxes and paid basically no taxes since. But that was basically the extent of his punishment for having gone so deeply in debt. Most importantly, this was largely settled in private. In public, Trump was the man who wrote The Art of the Deal. Trump did not write The Art of the Deal. He paid Tony Schwartz $250,000 and half of all royalties to write it for him. You can find Tony's name on the cover. And yet, Trump gained the fame. Trump couldn't sell airlines, casinos, or football teams, but he could sell his brand, and he was really good at it, which was important because Trump was starting to become interested in politics. In 1988, Trump had attended the GOP National Convention where George H.W. Bush accepted the Republican presidential nomination, and Trump was blown away by the attention, the affection, the worship that a presidential candidate gets when they become their party's nominee. He began to crave it, and he knew a man who said he could give it to him, Roger Stone. Roger Stone was a Republican operative who had been trying to turn Trump into a donor or a client for nearly a decade. He even commissioned polls that said Trump had a shot at the presidency if he ran on his business acumen. Even before Trump's experience at the 1988 GOP National Convention, he had contacted presumptive Republican presidential nominee George H.W. Bush to offer his services as vice president, which Bush politely declined. And I'm going to say, there's 2 versions of the story out there. The one I just told you is from the Bush side, from Meacham. You can see another side that the Bush team contacted Trump and then nothing happened of it. So 2 versions of that one. In 2000, Trump made a more aggressive pursuit of the presidency, briefly running for the Reform Party's presidential nomination, but that ended when he failed to generate any momentum. By 2002, Trump wasn't developing much property anymore, but he had put out 5 books with his name on the cover and was charging other developers to put his name on their goods or properties. They carried all the risk. Trump just cashed the checks. There was Trump deodorant, Trump underwear, Trump furniture. I kid you not, Trump urine tests. He did not own any of these businesses. They just paid him a cut to use his name because his name had come to have such cachet. Building his personal brand was paying off, but that brand was about to jolt into the stratosphere as a new opportunity came along. A TV producer wanted Trump to host season 1 of a new reality TV show, which was described as Survivor, but on concrete. Trump said okay. The TV show was The Apprentice, and it became huge. But it was also a mirage. In real life, Trump worked from a dingy and worn office. On The Apprentice, everything Trump touched turned to gold, and the office was gilded of gold and marble. And then Trump discovered Twitter and birtherism. In 2012, Trump became the face of the birther conspiracy, which claimed President Barack Obama had not been born in the United States, was not a citizen, and thus was constitutionally barred from the presidency. There was and is zero evidence to support this conspiracy. But far-right conservatives loved Trump for fanning it, especially since traditional Republicans refused to engage in it. The furthest right members of the party, the types most likely to vote in primaries, began to love Trump's willingness to stick it to the libs. On June 16th, 2015, 69-year-old Donald Trump rode a golden escalator down into the lobby of Trump Tower in New York City and announced he would pursue the GOP nomination for the presidency of the United States. Many thought it was a joke. One publication covered his campaign in its entertainment section. The guy who had told radio shock jocks that STDs were his Vietnam? The man on his third wife? The fella who had donated more money to Democrats than Republicans? He couldn't win. Until he did. TV and radio stations gave Trump more time than other candidates because he was so good for their ratings. They got the ad revenue, he got their platforms, and he used their platforms to dominate the narrative. Everyone else running for president was constantly reacting to whatever Trump had said that morning. Undecided voters started to think that maybe Trump could use his reputed golden touch to make government better, drain the swamp. Conservative voters heard Trump vowing to ban Muslims, repeal Obamacare, tariff China, or build a wall along the 1,954-mile U.S.-Mexico border, and they loved it. While every 2016 Republican was running on repealing Obamacare and lowering taxes, nobody else was running on banning Muslims or building a wall on the Mexican border. And with 17 other major candidates splitting the GOP vote, Trump's willingness to outflank all of them to the right, well, that was a winning strategy. One by one, Trump's rivals dropped out of the race. When the final two, firebrand Texas Senator Ted Cruz and moderate Ohio Governor John Kasich, tried to ally together to stop Trump down the stretch, it was too little, too late. To the shock of the GOP establishment, Trump won the Republican presidential nomination on the first ballot of the party's national convention. In the general election, Trump faced Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton, a former senator, Secretary of State, and First Lady, who had a lot of experience and a lot of baggage. But Trump's campaign appeared toast when, roughly 1 month before Election Day, an Access Hollywood tape was released that captured Trump saying,
"You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy."
Clinton's staffers cackled. They lolled. Surely Trump could never win, not now. Little did they know, another October surprise was on its way. On October 28th, 11 days before the election, FBI Director James Comey disregarded Department of Justice protocol to publicly reopen a closed investigation into an email server Clinton had maintained in her home when she was Secretary of State. The FBI is not supposed to publicly comment on investigations, yet Comey did here. The FBI is not supposed to influence elections, yet whether he intended to or not, Comey did here. He closed the investigation 9 days later, less than 48 hours before voting was to begin, but the damage was done. The final story on voters' minds going into Election Day was whether Clinton had broken the law or violated national security with her email server. But still, when Trump entered election night, he had no victory speech prepared. He didn't expect to win. He told people around him he merely hoped to keep it close. When the first exit polls were reported, they suggested a Clinton victory was on its way. But then Florida started counting its votes, and Trump was pulling ahead. And then he won North Carolina, and then he won Wisconsin, and that's when he won the presidency. In one sense, the polls were right. Donald Trump lost the popular vote, 63 million to 66 million. But the popular vote doesn't elect presidents. When Clinton was racking up votes in Democratic strongholds, Trump was eking out victories in battleground states, earning a 304 to 227 win in the Electoral College. After 30 years of dreaming, Donald Trump had been elected the 45th president of the United States. And so, on January 20th, 2017, Donald J. Trump, the property developer turned reality TV star who had once cameoed in Home Alone 2 and who had long dreamed of becoming president, was sworn in as the 45th president of the United States. At 70 years old, he set a new record for oldest person to ever become president, a record that has been broken twice in the 8 years since, first by Joe Biden and then again by Trump himself. But what did the world and the country look like when Trump became president? Let's look around. Internationally, the Islamic State of Syria, ISIS, which had surged across the Middle East and across international headlines in the final years of the Obama administration, was losing ground against a coalition of American air power and Arab ground power. Without having to lift a finger, Trump inherited an imminent victory. Nice! Ukraine was dealing with the aftermath of a 2014 Russian invasion of its eastern provinces, where a low-grade war against Russian-backed separatists continued to simmer. The first year of the war, Russian forces accidentally shot down a commercial airliner from Malaysia, killing all 298 people aboard. On the other side of Europe, English voters passed a referendum to leave the European Union, which nearly crashed their economy. The British economy is still roughly 5% smaller than it used to be as a result. Can you imagine another country so recklessly damaging its own economy? Thank goodness we'd never do that, right? Oh. 2016 was also the year of Pokemon Go. Gotta catch them all. Domestically, the United States was doing great when Trump became president. 8 years removed from the 2008 financial crisis, the GDP was growing and interest rates were near historical lows. Trump had lucked into a fantastic time to become president. The protests began immediately. Many Americans were unhappy that Trump had won the White House despite losing the popular vote, especially women who were offended by the Access Hollywood tape and Trump's treatment of women during the campaign. The day after Trump was sworn in, an estimated 470,000 people participated in a women's march in D.C., joined by maybe 4 million more Americans in marches across the country. 6 days after that, Trump signed Executive Order 13769, aka the Muslim ban. In an attempt to fulfill a campaign promise to ban Muslims from visiting the United States, Trump banned travel from 7 Muslim-majority countries: Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. This prompted more national protests at airports, where anyone just landing from one of those countries was forced to get back on planes and leave. But the biggest story on Trump's mind wasn't the Women's March, the Muslim ban, or the size of his inauguration crowd, although he was very upset when folks noted Obama's was bigger. The biggest story on his mind was Russia. It's time to fill in some details on the 2016 campaign I had left out. On June 9th, 2016, Trump's eldest son, Donald Trump Jr., his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his campaign manager, Paul Manafort, met at Trump Tower with a Kremlin-linked lawyer who had promised dirt on Hillary Clinton. 48 days later, Trump referenced the Clinton email investigation at a press conference when he said,
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press.
Within 24 hours, Russia attempted to hack that Clinton email server for the first time. That hacking attempt failed, but a phishing attempt aimed at a senior Clinton aide succeeded, and Russia stole a slew of emails that it handed to WikiLeaks for a constant drip of negative stories about Clinton and the Democratic Party. A drip that would increase to a stream whenever the news cycle turned negative for Trump. For example, thousands of emails were published in the days after that Hollywood Access tape. 12 Russians working out of a St. Petersburg office spent a year trying to influence Americans on social media, creating thousands of fake social media accounts, and at one point organizing a pro- and anti-Black Lives Matter protest at the same place at the same time to try to provoke a conflict. FBI Director James Comey, who had publicly reopened and closed that investigation into Clinton's email server 11 days before the election, he refused to publicly comment on Russia's attempts to influence the election. But after Election Day, Comey and other intelligence agency leaders met with President-elect Trump in New York to tell him what they knew. The Russians had interfered with the election, and they had done it to help Trump. Trump fumed after the meeting. He said he felt like American intelligence was trying to blackmail him. Like, we've got this on you. 2 weeks later, Trump, now president, invited Comey to the White House to ask if Comey wanted to stay on as FBI director. Comey said yes. Trump said, I need loyalty, and asked Comey to drop an investigation into Mike Flynn, a national security advisor who had lied about contacts with Russian agents and who would soon be fired after just 22 days on the job. Comey thought that was a weird request, so he wrote detailed notes on what was said after leaving the White House. He also refused to close the investigation, infuriating Trump. Trump's son-in-law and advisor, Jared Kushner, convinced Trump that Democrats were so angry with Comey for how he had handled the investigation into Clinton's emails that they would applaud Trump if he fired Comey. So Trump did just that, firing Comey 3 months after their one-on-one at the White House. And, for a second, Democratic voters did cheer, until they realized, hey, wait, wasn't Comey the guy investigating Trump's connections to Russia? Who will do that now? The answer was Robert Mueller. Months before Comey had even been fired, Trump's Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, had recused himself from anything related to Russia because he, too, had taken some untimely calls from the Russians. This meant his deputy, Rod Rosenstein, was in charge of anything related to Russia. After Comey was fired, Rosenstein appointed a special counsel to investigate Trump's 2017 campaign. The man he chose to lead that investigation was former FBI director and registered Republican Robert Mueller, who Trump spent the next 2 years accusing of being a Democrat. From Mueller's May 2017 appointment through March 2019, the publication of his final report, Trump tried his best to kill the Mueller investigation. He ordered White House counsel Don McGahn to fire Mueller, but McGahn refused to do it and said he would resign if Trump pressed the matter. Trump tried to get AG Jeff Sessions to unrecuse himself and do it, but Sessions refused. The longer the investigation went, the more of Trump's allies who either flipped or went to jail for crimes like money laundering, tax fraud, campaign finance violations, lying to Congress, and obstruction of justice. One of Trump's consultants, Konstantin Kilimnik, was found to have been a Russian intelligence asset. When Mueller asked to interview Trump, Trump initially agreed until his lawyers forbade him from doing so, afraid he would perjure himself if interviewed. On March 22, 2019, the investigation finally reached its end. Mueller submitted a 448-page report to the Department of Justice and later testified to Congress. But the end result of his 2-year investigation was largely a nothing burger. Mueller made clear that because Department of Justice policy says you cannot indict a sitting president, he avoided the question of whether Trump should be indicted or not, writing, quote, "This report does not conclude that the president committed a crime. It also does not exonerate him." Some Democrats saw this as Mueller encouraging Congress to impeach Trump, arguing that Mueller had handed them a 448-page case for impeachment. But House Speaker Nancy Pelosi refused to open impeachment hearings, saying she would only go there if, quote, "there's something so compelling and overwhelming and bipartisan." This wasn't it. Trump celebrated the end of the Mueller investigation. The very next day, he basically created a new one. The day after Mueller testified to Congress, Trump had a phone call with Ukraine's newly elected president, Volodymyr Zelensky. Zelensky asked Trump for weapon systems that Congress had authorized for Ukraine, but that Trump had held up. Remember, Ukraine had been at war with Russian-backed separatists ever since Russia invaded eastern Ukraine 5 years earlier. Instead of responding to Zelensky's request for weapons, Trump said, quote, "I would like you to do us a favor." He then asked Zelensky to open a Ukrainian investigation into potential Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden and Biden's son Hunter. 1 day later, an intelligence community inspector general was told by a whistleblower, quote, "The president used the call to persuade Ukrainian authorities to investigate his political rivals, and there was already a conversation underway with White House lawyers about how to handle the discussion because, in the official's view, the president had clearly committed a criminal act by urging a foreign power to investigate a U.S. person for the purpose of advancing his own re-election bid in 2020. When the memo reached Nancy Pelosi, she decided this was the compelling, overwhelming, and bipartisan case for impeachment she had been waiting for. After 3 months of mostly televised hearings, 2 articles of impeachment were revealed on December 10th. Abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. 8 days later, Congress voted to impeach Trump on both counts, largely along party lines. The impeachment then moved to the Senate, the first Senate impeachment trial since Bill Clinton's in 1999, and only the 3rd Senate impeachment trial ever. And here, the process took a turn. The impeachment inquiry had happened in the House, which was controlled by Democrats. They got to set the pace, the rules, and invite any witnesses they liked. The Senate was controlled by Republicans, and GOP Majority Leader Mitch McConnell got to set the rules for the trial. The pace would be fast, and there would be no witnesses, even after it came out that Trump's recent national security advisor, John Bolton, was about to publish a book that would verify much of what the Democrats were alleging. Republicans accused Bolton of being a disgruntled employee out for revenge. A Pew Research poll showed that 1/4 of Americans thought Trump had done nothing wrong, 1/4 weren't sure, and 48% thought he should have been impeached. But with McConnell running the show, the outcome was almost preordained. The largely party line vote was 52-48 against the abuse of power charge and 53-47 against the obstruction of Congress charge. Utah Senator Mitt Romney was the lone Republican to vote for impeachment on abuse of power. It was February 5th, 2020. After 3 years of being hounded by Russia-related investigations or impeachment hearings, Trump was finally free to enjoy the presidency. 34 days later, a global pandemic was declared. The exact origin of COVID-19 is still a mystery, but the first reported cases date to mid-December 2019, when patients in the Chinese city of Wuhan began experiencing a pneumonia-like illness that didn't respond to the standard treatments. Chinese authorities traced these initial cases back to a seafood market and ordered it closed on January 1st. But cases continued to pop up. On January 11th, China reported its first death from the novel virus. Days later, cases were confirmed in Thailand and Japan. On January 20th, the first case was reported in the United States. China placed Wuhan, population 11 million, on lockdown to try to contain the virus, but it was already out there. The global infection count was doubling every 2 days. On January 23rd, Trump received his first security briefing on the virus. He was told it was the biggest national security threat to his presidency. He placed a partial ban on travel from China, exempting only American citizens. Globally, death tolls were rising. On February 10th, 1 month after the first reported death, the number of global dead eclipsed 1,000. On February 11th, the disease was officially given a name, COVID-19, aka Coronavirus Disease 2019. As the virus spread, Trump created a presidential task force to better control what information was being shared. He didn't want panic over the virus to damage the economy or his re-election chances. He kept telling people that one day it would just disappear. On March 11th, with 118,000 cases and 4,291 deaths reported across 114 countries, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. Major League Baseball and the NHL suspended their seasons. College athletic tournaments were canceled. Trump banned travel from Europe. A national emergency was declared. Days later, states followed with shutdowns. Schools closed their doors. Work went remote. Travelers raced home, and then airports, train stations, and city streets became eerily quiet. Except for the sirens. New York City, population 8 million, became an epicenter of the pandemic. Hospitals were overwhelmed with COVID patients, which had a negative knock-on effect for every other New Yorker who needed medical care. Got pneumonia? Good luck getting into the hospital. The halls were full of COVID victims on respirators. At its height, a New Yorker was dying every 2 minutes. Morgues ran out of room for the bodies, which piled up in trucks and chapels. The healthcare system was being overwhelmed. To try to allay panic, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo began giving daily press briefings on the spread and response to the virus. These were picked up by every major news network, and Trump became jealous of the favorable ratings and reviews Cuomo was getting. Vice President Mike Pence and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease Director Anthony Fauci were giving similar daily briefings from the White House podium. Trump wanted to get more involved. Trump took over the daily White House COVID briefing. On March 31st, he said it was going to be a very rough 2 weeks. More than 2 weeks later, he suggested sick Americans shine bright lights on their skin or self-inject disinfectant to kill the virus. Never do this. This will kill you. Behind closed doors, Trump told his team to prioritize aid to states based on how vocally their governors were praising his performance. On May 15th, Trump ordered the resources of the U.S. government go all in on developing a vaccine. Operation Warp Speed developed multiple versions of a potential COVID vaccine, including some using new mRNA technology. The idea was most of these vaccine attempts would fail, but hopefully some would work, and sure enough, some did work. The first doses of a successful vaccine were available 7 months later, in December of 2020. But it wasn't COVID that caused the most jarring death of the summer of 2020. That May, police were called on a black man accused of using a counterfeit $20 bill. The officers forced the man onto the ground and then knelt on his neck and back for over 8 minutes. Bystander video captured the man gasping, "I can't breathe," and then he died. His name was George Floyd, and his death sparked a national protest movement against police mistreatment of minorities, especially of black communities. Hundreds of thousands took to the streets, and Trump was annoyed. 2020 was an election year. He had been told that he could not hold rallies, but Black Lives Matter protesters were allowed to mass in the streets? That's not fair. Trump took the side of police against the protesters. He became especially furious when it leaked to the press that a protest near the White House had prompted the Secret Service to rush Trump into a secure bunker. Trump thought it made him look weak. He didn't want to look weak. He wanted to look strong. He wanted troops in the streets. He asked his defense secretary if the army could shoot protesters in the legs. On June 1st, police used tear gas and concussion grenades to clear protesters from around the White House so Trump could walk to a nearby church for a photo op with a Bible. He grabbed several aides for the walk, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the defense secretary, but both bailed early in the walk and became furious, saying they felt they'd been used as props. A press conference was quickly organized where they provided statements that troops should not be used against Americans. Trump chewed them out. And then all the drama of 2020, the pandemic, the protests, it began to swirl with the presidential campaign. Disregarding the advice of his health officials, Trump organized a kickoff rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, site of a 1921 race massacre where 800 African Americans had been killed. Trump was told that more than 1 million people had registered for tickets online. An external seating area was built for the anticipated overflow crowd. But when Trump arrived, he discovered he'd been tricked. Most of the free tickets had been reserved by internet pranksters. The rally didn't spill outside. It didn't even fill the arena. The stands were mostly empty. Trump felt he looked like a fool. Trump's personal inclination was to be a germaphobe. His hands were often red and raw from overuse of disinfectant wipes. An aide carrying hand sanitizer was always close on hand. And that was well before COVID began. So you would think he'd be all about masking. But his chief of staff told him early on that his political base would never support masking, so he swore off mask mandates and largely refused to wear them. He later contracted COVID and nearly died. On October 2nd, 2020, Trump tweeted that he and Melania had COVID. That was 3 days after a presidential debate with Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden and 6 days after Trump had actually first tested positive. By the time his illness was revealed on Twitter, it was serious. He was put on oxygen due to low oxygen blood levels. Experimental monoclonal antibody treatments were ordered to save his life. When he was flown to Walter Reed Medical Hospital for more extensive treatment, he was told he could die. He was given a heavy-duty steroid that was known to cause mood swings to help stabilize him. But still, he refused to let Vice President Mike Pence temporarily assume the powers of the presidency for even a moment. After 3 nights at Walter Reed, Trump emerged into the clear. Doctors came to believe the experimental antibodies had saved his life. When Trump left Walter Reed, the presidential election was less than a month away, and Biden was up 10 points in the polls. Trump kept telling his supporters that the polls were wrong, fake news, that he was going to win, that the only way we lose is if they cheat. But they didn't cheat, and Trump still lost. 81 million Americans voted for Joe Biden in 2020. 74 million voted for Trump. In the Electoral College, Trump lost 306 to 232. He had been defeated, but he refused to say so. Instead of giving a concession speech, Trump said, "Frankly, we did win this election." Privately, he sang a different tune, saying, "We did our best, and I thought we had it." But while some advisors encouraged him to concede, others were telling him to fight. When he asked one group what they thought, he was told there was a 5% chance he could turn the election around through legal challenges. Have you ever seen the end of Dumb and Dumber? When Lloyd asks Mary, "What are the chances of a guy like you and a girl like me ending up together?" Not good. Like 1 out of 100? More like 1 out of 1,000,000. So, you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah! Trump heard 5%, and he replied, "I think it's more like 40 or 50%. I'm getting strong Lloyd energy from this moment. But you can't have Lloyd without Harry, and Rudy Giuliani was right there to be Harry. Giuliani said the election had been stolen by Italian space satellites. No, wait! A dead Venezuelan dictator had hacked the machines. No conspiracy theory was too outlandish. On November 7th, 4 days after the election had been held, Giuliani, with sweaty makeup pouring down his face, held a press conference at Four Seasons. Not Four Seasons Hotel, Four Seasons Landscaping. He was roasted by the press. But the movement didn't melt. It grew stronger. Stop the Steal became the ironic rallying cry of people trying to steal the election from Joe Biden. Trump pressured GOP legislators to submit Trump electors from states Trump had lost without any luck. When Trump called Georgia, which he had lost to Biden by 11,779 votes, he told Georgia's Secretary of State, "I just want to find 11,780 votes." Georgia officials recorded the call and leaked it to the press. Trump raised money off the fraud claims, lots of money, more than $200 million, but he wasn't winning his legal challenges. As November turned to December, turned to January, he was running out of time. And then a new memo began circulating the White House. A lawyer named John Eastman had speculated that when the election was certified by Congress on January 6th, Vice President Mike Pence could refuse to certify electors from states where electors were being disputed. Disputed by who? It didn't matter. Anybody. No evidence was needed. If enough states were rejected this way, the election would be thrown to the House of Representatives, where the outcome would be determined by the number of states each candidate could carry, with each state delegation being worth one collective vote, like one for Texas, one for Alabama. The chamber had more Democrats, but Republicans controlled more state delegations. Trump could win. There was just one problem. Pence thought the whole idea was blatantly unconstitutional. On January 4, Trump summoned Pence and Eastman to his office. Eastman made his pitch. Pence pushed back. Eastman conceded that, maybe Trump didn't have the power to refuse to certify the election. Pence turned to Trump. "Did you hear that, Mr. President?" It would seem he did not. On January 5th, Pence's chief of staff told the Vice President's Secret Service detail that Trump's public feud with Pence could become a security threat to the VP. About that. When the sun rose on January 6th, two crowds of Trump supporters began to form, one at the Capitol building and one near the White House. Trump had been promoting the White House rally for weeks, tweeting things like, "Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there, we'll be wild." But when the day arrived, Trump's crowd appeared smaller than he had expected. To get more supporters into the rally space, Trump ordered metal detectors be removed. Weapons would now be allowed into the crowd. At 11:20, Trump had a final phone call with Mike Pence, telling him, "Mike, you can do this. I'm counting on you to do it. If you don't do it, I picked the wrong man 4 years ago." When Pence said he would not block the election certification, Trump called him a pussy. He then left the White House to address his supporters. A line of speakers had warmed up the crowd. Giuliani had called for trial by combat. Trump took the rostrum. "We're going to have to fight much harder," Trump said. "Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us, and if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country because you're sworn to uphold the Constitution." And then Trump told his supporters to go to the Capitol. When Trump tried to go with them, his Secret Service detail refused to allow it. It wasn't safe. Trump lunged forward to try to grab the steering wheel and had to be held back. His supporters marched to the Capitol without him. When they encountered barriers, they moved past them. When police told them to stop their advance, they advanced. They climbed scaffoldings and walls. They broke doors and windows. When police stood in their way, they assaulted the officers. Trump was alerted that police lines had collapsed. He did nothing. A pipe bomb was found at the Republican National Committee. Another would be found at the Democratic National Committee. Trump did nothing. Inside the Capitol building, oblivious senators friendly to Trump had been raising objections to the electoral counts of Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. They offered no evidence. This was to be the setup for Pence to reject the election's outcome. But before Pence's moment even arose, loud noises halted proceedings. Thousands of Trump supporters had breached the building and were looking for the Senate. Some were armed. Some carried zip ties. When House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy told Trump directly that rioters were breaking into his office, Trump said the rioters were more upset about the election results than McCarthy was. The doors to the House chamber were barricaded and guns pointed at them in case the crowd broke in. The Senate chamber was evacuated and occupied by the protesters, who stole papers and documents off the desks and from Senate and House offices. Trump did nothing. Pence was evacuated seconds ahead of the advancing mob. Trump wrote on Twitter, "Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country." A scaffold was built outside the Capitol. A noose was hung. Trump's supporters chanted, "Hang Mike Pence." Watching events on TV, Trump told his aides that maybe Pence should be hanged. 2 hours and 20 minutes after his supporters first pushed past Capitol barricades, Trump wrote a tweet requesting everyone at the Capitol to remain peaceful. It was not peaceful, but gradually law enforcement and reinforcements corralled Trump supporters back out of the building. Hours later, law enforcement secured the Capitol and restored order. At 6 p.m., Trump tweeted, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots." At 7 p.m., the Senate resumed the certification process. It worked into the night. At 3:40 a.m. the following morning, Congress certified Biden's electoral victory over Trump. More than 2,000 people entered the Capitol on January 6th. 5 people died in connection to the riot. 1,270 were convicted. Spoiler alert, earlier this year, Trump pardoned all of them. The immediate reaction to January 6th was a bipartisan backlash against Trump, blaming him for what was quickly called an insurrection. The final 2 weeks of Trump's presidency were another impeachment inquiry and trial, this time at warp speed. But the results were not much different from the first. 232 congressmen and women voted to impeach, all Democrats plus 10 Republicans, and 57 senators found Trump guilty of inciting insurrection, all 48 Democrats, both independents, plus 7 Republicans, but this was still shy of the 67 senators needed to convict. On January 20th, 2021, Inauguration Day, Trump's presidency ended, and nobody ever heard from him again. Okay, that's obviously not true, but Trump's post-presidency and second presidency will have to wait for a future episode. And when we get there, I will pick it up right here. So, how had America changed during the 4 years of the Trump administration? Well, 450,000 Americans had been killed by COVID, and the COVID-19 mortality rate was 40% higher in the United States than it was in other wealthy Group of 7 nations. Trump had successfully passed a $1.9 trillion tax cut, which he partially offset by cutting food and housing assistance for the needy. Trump had tried to undo anything Barack Obama had accomplished. He abandoned the Iran nuclear deal, the Paris Climate Agreement, the diplomatic opening with Cuba, and a free trade deal with 12 Asian countries. He tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, but he was defeated by 3 Republican defections and a dramatic last-minute no vote from Senator John McCain. Trump had promised to build a wall along the 1,954-mile border with Mexico and to make Mexico pay for it. He built 80 miles of new wall. He replaced another 372 miles of pre-existing wall, and Mexico did not pay for it. Trump implemented a policy of separating children from parents when apprehended crossing the border to deter migration. It had been 4 years of cultural protest and upheaval, headlined by the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter. Oh, and Fyre Fest happened in 2017. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up. Internationally, an estimated 3 million people had died from COVID globally. And the Trump administration helped negotiate a normalization of relations between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco in 2020. On the technology front, Nintendo released the Switch in 2017, and I discovered I'm still good at Mario Kart. If you're going to remember 3 things from the first Trump term, I would suggest: 1, he was the first president to be impeached twice in the House and acquitted twice in the Senate. 2, the COVID outbreak began on his watch, and American death rates were higher than other comparable nations. 3, after Trump refused to accept the outcome of the 2020 election, his supporters attacked the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to disrupt the certification of the presidential election results. And yes, I know this is kind of tied to the first one, but it's big enough that it deserves its own thing. 2 impeachments and January 6th. What lessons in leadership can we learn from Trump? Well, no matter how many experts tell you that you don't have a chance in whatever pursuit you undertake, there's always a chance you might prove them wrong. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you would like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. This helps me buy bucks and pay to host the show, and thank you so much to everyone who's contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. The primary biography for today's episode was Confidence Man, The Making of Donald Trump by Maggie Haberman. In our next episode, well, there won't be a next episode for a while. It is May 2025. Joe Biden left office 4 months ago. We need to let time pass so biographies can be written. I can read them, and a script can be written. When that time comes, I'll be back. In the meantime, I've got another project on my mind. Stay tuned to this podcast feed for details down the line, and also, I will likely continue to interview the periodic historian as new books are released on past presidents, so keep an eye out for that future content. So, for now, so long from Abridged Presidential Histories, and good luck out there.